All right, we'll get this hearing started, and I'll recognize Mr. Higgins with our Mississippi Public Employment Retirement System to give us an update on PERS.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I certainly appreciate the invitation and the chance to be here and visit with you. Hope everyone can hear. Just let me know. We'll adjust the microphone. But like I said, appreciate the chance to be here and thank you for your time. And look forward to visiting with you because I think it's very important that we work together. You know, the legislature as policymakers, PERS as the fiduciaries. I just think it's important we work together. It's always good to work with you. PERS is stable. We just have to work together to keep it that way. You'll see on the table there before you a blue packet of information, a lot of good detail, a lot of good information there. I don't plan to speak directly from that today, but some of the information that I'll cover is certainly in there, and you can have that to take back with you to your constituency and so on and so forth. I thought what I would do today, if agreeable, is give a brief update or overview of the status or key metrics and key information in the system, and then also reiterate the importance of PERS, and then talk about the employer contribution rate and say the last couple decades and things like that, and certainly leave time for plenty of questions. As far as the key information, as you know, we're a defined benefit pension plan. We're roughly a $30 billion pension plan. As of this morning, it was around $31.7 billion. We cover, as a unified system, we cover all of the non-federal government employees in the state. We have over 300,000 in total membership. We have around 144,000 in active members. We have around 114,000 retirees. The average benefit for a retiree, including the cost of living adjustment, is around $26,000. The average member salary paying into PERS is around $45,000. And we have around 74 retirees in the system that are over 100. So we're certainly all striving to be one of those retirees one day. And right now we have around 74. As far as our asset allocation, what you'll see in the documents before you as far as our target asset allocation of the portfolio is 61% equities, 20% fixed income, 10% real estate, 8% private equity, and then 1% cash and other. And there are some slight changes underway now in the process. I really appreciate your support. You may remember from last year a change in legislation to give us a little bit more flexibility. So we really appreciate that. And we're in the process of making some minor changes, adding private credit and infrastructure. So the target allocations will be a little bit different, but those are the allocations that you would see in the documents with you. As far as last year's fiscal year return, unfortunately, it was around a negative 8.5%. We certainly would prefer that to be more positive, but it was around a negative 8.5%. Even with that, we did still exceed our benchmark. In other words, it could have been worse. And as far as the 5-year returns, the 10-year and other returns continue to exceed the benchmark and our peer group comparisons. And we really have to focus on the long term, as I've said before, whether it's a good year or a negative return, we still have to focus on the long term. As far as the reasons why there was the negative 8.5%, there were economic challenges for everyone throughout the economy and the market, as many of you know. I'm sure you read about it, heard about it, saw it in your personal lives. So there was just many economic challenges for everyone, to include, you had inflation, you got the war in Ukraine. It was just a challenging last 6 months to our fiscal year. You had, again, inflation, the war in Ukraine, energy prices. It was just a challenging year overall. The equity markets had their worst year in decades. The fixed income markets had their worst year in decades. And like other pension plans throughout the country, we encountered some of the same things. We actually also, equities and fixed income were also down together, which is not typically the case. Our investment consultants, we asked them to do some research and look back. And if I remember correctly, over the last 100 years on a quarterly basis, those two asset classes being down together only happened about 10% of the time. And I think only twice on an annual basis, but that's what happened, for our fiscal year that was challenging. Now, there were some bright spots. Again, we did exceed the benchmark, could have been worse. And then private equity and real estate did well, each returning 26 or 22%. So we did have a few bright spots.
Right. Let me stop you right there real quick. You just said something really fast. I want to make sure I understood. You said you with a negative 8.5% return, you exceeded your benchmark. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, we have a custom benchmark each year that's designed based on our, the allocation of our portfolio. So even though we had a negative 8.5, the benchmark comparison was down even further. I want to say it was probably down to negative 10. So compared to the benchmark, the relative performance was still in excess of the benchmark, but the absolute return was the negative 8.5%.
So what is the benchmark? What is that set from? Is that just an average of what other plans lost? Is that just a market analysis, or is that just something y'all set up saying, let's hope we don't lose more than 10%?
No, it's a very detailed thing. I can give you the exact specifics. It's a weighted custom type benchmark that we developed with our investment consultant and with the staff. And it's designed to be a good and adequate and accurate benchmark of performance based on our allocation. So we'll have a certain weighting towards, say, the Russell 3000, a certain amount toward the S&P, or a certain amount toward Bloomberg, whatever the fixed income is, to compare to see, here's the target, here's the benchmark to see how we're doing. And I can get you the exact specifics of that. I just don't know it off the top of my head.
Okay. I guess what I'm wondering is, when do you set the benchmark? Is this something retroactive that you're looking at based on the market? This is the benchmark, or is this something you're forecasting?
It's set way in advance and remains constant or somewhat constant. I don't remember. Charles, when's the last time we changed it? It's probably been. So it's set and it's stayed, we don't change it from year to year. It's set in advance of the year and we monitor according to that. And then separately, we do a peer group comparison where our investment consultant, which is Callan, they're the consultant for a lot of other large public pension funds. They'll have a database, and they'll have a database of those that are, say, over 10 billion, in the size group of us, and we'll compare that as well. Thank you for that. Excellent question, and we'll follow up with the exact specifics of the benchmark. The fiscal year to date return through December 31st, this fiscal year through the end of December, was about 0.17%. So not in the negative territory, but certainly not the way we would prefer it. As you know, the economic challenges still continue. As far as an estimated fiscal year to date return through January, and it is just estimated, but it's up over 5%. So January has been more positive. So currently we're estimating a little over 5%. So hopefully that positive trend will continue. Certainly there's a lot of volatility that's back, depending upon where you stand on it, whether you think we've already had a recession or if we're going into a recession. It's safe to say certainly there's volatility in the market. So we'll just have to finish up the year. As far as our funded ratio, the actuarial funded ratio, it's around 61%. We've stated around 61% for the last several years. Now, what that is on an actuarial basis is comparing where we stand in a snapshot in time on an actuarial basis, the actuarial assets to the actuarial liabilities. And that's the ratio that you hear from time to time. Again, it's currently around 61% and has been for several years. Now, that other 39% is really what makes up the unfunded liability that you hear about or that we talk about, and then I'll talk more about in a moment. That other 39% or 20 billion is what that is. Now, I would like to take a moment to briefly reiterate the importance of PERS. And I know you've heard me say it before. I think we all share this opinion, but I think it bears repeating. And each time I get a chance to speak to a group, I try to share it because I do think that PERS is so important to the state of Mississippi in the terms of dollars and also in the terms of people. In the terms of dollars, we now pay out over $3 billion annually in retirement benefit payments. Over 90% of that stays in the state of Mississippi, goes to every county in Mississippi, has a multiplier effect, ripples through the economy, creates hundreds of millions of dollars in tax revenue, and is just a major economic driver. It's estimated to create about $3 billion in economic impact. And if you think about that for just a second, think about the industries that's comparable to, or maybe the various projects or growth projects or tax incentives and things like that. And of course, I'm not having an opinion on those. I think those are all positive things. But if you think about the economic impact of PERS in that $3 billion, it's essentially a recession-proof impact stream, very important to the state in the terms of dollars in every county. Now, also very important in terms of people. And I think it's very important that we remember the people behind the numbers. At a total membership up over 300,000, that's 10% of the state's population in direct contact, not even counting relatives and so forth. So it's just very important. And the people behind the numbers certainly are public servants like you, but you've got nurses, law enforcement, first responders, those working in the cold weather to help with the water. So a lot of key folks that are working hard for the benefit. We have to remember the people behind the numbers. And I'll take a moment at just one little quick personal story. And I know we all have them. We all can relate to that. But my dad, for example, I've used him at times in the past about his pension that I know that sustains him. Now, he's got a small retirement from the county that I grew up in, which is not here. but I know that helped support him. Recently, unfortunately, had a major medical type issue, and he's now much better, but in a memory care home not too far from here. So I know that his benefit will help him that. But the more relevant part to hear is when we moved in recently and he sat down for lunch, and the first day they introduced him to the guy, and they said, this is Mr. So-and-so. He's a retired superintendent of school. And right away, my PERS flag went up because I thought, I bet you that gentleman has a PERS benefit, and that's helping care for him and will help care for him for the rest of his life, referring to the other guy. Now, I don't know who it is, but it's just a personal story, realizing how important that the people behind the numbers are. And I know y'all have your own personal stories there as well. As far as the employer contribution rate, to talk a little bit about that, as you know, and have probably heard, the board in the December meeting recently voted to increase the employer contribution rate up to 22.4%. Based on actuarial recommendations and based on the metrics in the funding policy, all being prompted to require that the actuary recommend that to the board. And the metrics being projected funded ratio, cash flow as a percentage of assets, and the ADEC ratio, ADEC meaning being the acronym for the actuarial determined contribution. So that was voted to increase to 22.4% based on the actuarial recommendations and requirements. And I just want to say that we are certainly very sympathetic to the cost on employers, cost on the state, cost on the locals. We understand that. We appreciate the seriousness of it. But as fiduciaries, we have to do what's best for the membership and for the system to make sure that everything's are adequately funded. And as PERS, we're the fiduciaries. We really only administer the systems that are designed and set up in law. And under current law, and I know the law certainly can be changed, but under current law, the employer contribution rate is really the only lever that the system or the board has to pull. To explain a little bit of the background as to the reason for the increase. Excuse me just a minute. I want to move that. It certainly has to do with certainly the last year or couple years, and the more recent returns are certainly related. But it's really much more than that. PERS and where we are, and again, PERS is stable. We just have to work together to keep it that way. And it's a very important system and benefit for so many in the state. But where we are and where we stand is really an accumulation of everything that's happened since we were created around 70 years ago. Every decision, every law change, every economic downturn, every board decision, it's an accumulation of that. And I'm going to just speak mainly to the last couple decades. To kind of bring us to present, to give a little background about the rate and the unfunded liability. And as I start, I'll say, while we may all have and should have the opportunity to work together to work on solutions, and I hope we do, many of the challenges we face and the challenges that we'll be trying to manage through really started long before any of us were involved. And if some of you were in the legislature, maybe I'm sure you were in a different position and maybe not in leadership or as involved. And to recap the last 2 decades, and to do my version of some of the major, and a handful of factors that have influenced the system. You go back to the late 90s and the early 2000s. Late 90s, early 2000s, there were some additional benefits passed into law without additional funding. And that's important because those in the system at the time received additional benefits, and the funding, wasn't provided or adjusted at the time. After that, you kind of recap the last 2 decades.
Let me ask you something. When was that? When did that happen?
99 through about 2001, I think. Definitely the late 90s, early 2000s. I believe that
They added additional benefits to the existing plan.
Yes, sir.
So they changed the plan, added benefits to it, and did not provide funding for those benefits that are added.
Yes, sir. That's my understanding, starting in 1999, 99, 2000, maybe 2001. And I'm sure there were different conversations and other things we could talk to that or at the time, but yes, sir. And there were a handful of changes in that time period, but 2 of the main ones that come to mind is what is now the current cost of living adjustment, and then also the benefit accrual rate. So you had benefit changes in the late 90s and early 2000s. During the last 2 decades, we've had a declining active to retiree ratio, meaning we've had fewer actives paying into the system. And we've had more retirees as a maturing system like PERS, being around 70 years, you have more retirees coming on to the payroll and retirees living longer. Now, that's a good thing, but there's a cost to that. And I believe that over the last 10 years, the active number has went down about 10 or 11%, and the retiree number has gone up about 25, 26, 27%, somewhere in that range. During that 20-year period, give or take, we've had several recessions, including the Great Recession. You have the downturn in the early 2000s. You have the big one around 08 and 09, the global financial crisis. And then you have at least the short one associated with the pandemic. And there may be some others that we've left out there. But at the same time, during that 20 years, the benefits kept growing, regardless of the economic downturn or regardless of the funded status, the benefits in law kept growing. And then the last thing I'll try to recap associated with the last couple decades is what I would call changes in the community. And by community, I mean the actuarial community, I mean the bond rating agencies, the public pension community, the investment consultants, the think tanks, the policy organizations, the political organizations, just all of the above. Anybody with a interest in monitoring public pensions have kind of changed through the time with a more conservative approach on certain things. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. And that could be better for systems. That could be better for PERS. That could be better for a conservative state like Mississippi, but it has a cost. And I'm gonna mention two main examples. One is the assumed rate of return. The other one is the amortization approach. As far as the assumed rate of return, that's arguably the most important assumption. It's certainly one of the most influential that we use because it's the amount that your assets are projected to grow. It also doubles as the discount rate for factoring in liabilities. It's currently at 7.55%. There are those that would say that's too high. We're above the median. If we were to look nationally, we're above the median. We may be the highest in the NASRA, which is the National Association of State Retirement Administrators. We may be one of the highest in their database. I think we're the only one now that's over 7.5. Now, there's good reasons for that. And we're in a transition downward. The actuary has recommended it be 7%. The board has a funding policy to transition down to that. And I'd like to see it.
Mr. Higgins,
Yes, sir.
I gotta get you to slow down talking. You're running over my head so fast with some of this stuff, and I need you to slow down just a little bit. And I'm probably gonna need you to wrap up in about a minute. So we got a lot of questions that want to be asked, and I want to give you time to kind of finish up. But if you don't mind, just slow down just a little bit with what you're saying. It's hard for me to hear. Maybe it's me, but I apologize.
No problem. It's probably me. I've been told I'm a fast talker sometimes, and I joked to somebody one time, said, "You're one of the fastest talking Southerners I've heard." So sorry about that.
That's
Be
okay.
happy to do that, and happy to revisit some of it with you individually or as a group, or come back.
Yeah.
And happy to wrap up and take questions down the rest.
Are you at a good place to? I mean, so obviously you're talking about the rate of return and the amortization.
There are some key things there, but I can wrap up. I would just like to just mention one thing if I could, even though it'll probably be with a question, but I'll just mention that as far as those things I was saying, a few others I can come back to later, are what has led to the $20 billion unfunded. And it's the unfunded that we're talking about that is primarily driving the employer contribution rate, and the great majority of that rate goes toward paying that unfunded. But I'd be happy to pause for questions.
So the unfunded liability, you cite the lack of, or the smaller number of state employees getting into the system, the higher number of employees that are retiring. Is that the major factor?
It is a main factor. It's not the only factor, but it's certainly a factor. Now, you've got the investment results and other things. That's certainly a factor.
All right. How much of this 5%, I guess, what was the employer contribution before y'all raised it? It was
17.4.
It was 17.4. Have you got a dollar amount of what that's going to impact to schools, to cities, to counties, to each kind of segment of the population of PERS?
We do, and some of it I can share. It's estimated to bring in around 345 million to the system. 265 million approximately of that would be from what I'll call the state supported entities, which would include public schools. The rest of it would be from locals, but we can give you a spreadsheet after this meeting that shows it by each category.
Okay. So 265 million roughly is coming from schools. Are state employees in that?
That's right. That would be schools, colleges, universities, state agencies, state supported, state funded entities.
Okay. Obviously the state puts in on some of these. What are some of these, like cities, counties, school districts? How are they going to come up with the funds to do this?
Well, we certainly have to, we're sympathetic to the cost of it, and we have to defer to them for the management of their overall budgets at the individual level and then at the county or city level, but either through existing budgets or whatever revenue streams they choose to modify.
Okay. All right. We've had conversations in the past about management. We've had bills in the past that have given y'all some leeway to be flexible with the management of the funds. Have y'all bid out? Is that something y'all bid out yearly or every 2 years or 3 years on the managers and how much they charge? I guess, do you bid out, RFP out the management of the funds for PERS?
We do something that's the equivalent. When we need to do a manager search, if you will, we certainly, I'll say this, we monitor our investment managers on a regular and ongoing basis. We monitor it with the board, at least on certainly a quarterly basis. So it's ongoing, and anytime that we need to do a manager search for whatever reason, a new allocation or the manager's not performing, or if the manager's on the watch list and hasn't improved or anything, we'll do something that's very comparable to an RFP. We'll work with Callan, who's our investment consultant, and they have a large database, and between them and our staff, we'll start a very extensive process to screen down and do certainly something that's comparable, probably even more so than your standard procurement RFP for selecting.
When's the last time y'all done that?
Probably the last meeting or two within the last year. We do it pretty regularly. You remember the last time? Yeah. Yeah. Recently, it's ongoing. We've selected a manager, either a passive or active in the recent past. But back to the management fees, we do pay out around $100 million annually in investment management fees, which sounds like a large number on the surface, but it's only 0.30 something percent, not 30%, but 0.30 something percent. So around a third of 1% or less. So the 100 million sounds large, but the in the relative terms, it's much smaller. And as Charles was alluding to, on a periodic basis, we do a comparison to make sure that the fees, not only in a relative basis I just described, but to make sure that in the market that there are competitive fees. And last time we did that, all of our active managers were, at or below the median. So we definitely keep a regular eye on that.
Okay. I'd like to go back to the question I asked earlier. I'd like to know when the last time y'all done an RFP for money managers over the last 10 years, how many times y'all done it?
Many. Now, we don't necessarily do a traditional RFP. We'll do a very extensive process that I just described. I can't give you the exact count off the top of my head, but I certainly can get that for you. And
Okay.
it'd be many searches over 10 years for sure.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Senator Sparks, do you have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The executive director, were you who presented last year? I just want to make sure. Did
Yes,
you
sir.
present last year? Okay. There were a series of questions that dealt with funding and dealt with the future and dealt with actual numbers. And I apologize, I have not gone back and listened to that, but you gave an estimate that we would be a percentage funded that I want to say was in the 80s within a certain number of years. And that struck me as odd. And I asked that question. Do you recall that question?
Yes, sir, I do.
All right. You've not made any such prediction this year that I've heard. Do you have that prediction?
No, sir. And what basically I think you're referring to is last year, the projected funding ratio coming off the higher returns in the more record year influenced the projected funding ratio in a positive way. And now this year with the negative returns and the negative outlook, it's affected it in a more negative way. So that's the difference. And this, under this year's results, is projected, I believe, to be 48%. Now, they're just projections, as mentioned last year. They're just estimates based on the assumptions, but.
I hold that. I mean, I understand that and I recall that, but everybody in the room could have assumed interest rates were climbing. Everybody in the room could assume rates of return are going to be down, which is why I asked that particular question. And the numbers speak for themselves. Now, you brought in a personal story. I'm going to give you a very quick one. My mother's also a beneficiary. We know real people are behind the numbers. Real people are also trying to keep these cities and towns and counties above the red line. So that 5% is very difficult. Now, I understand the chairman has asked you, when's the last time or how many times that PERS has looked at their management team, their investment team, and you're going to get that info to him. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. Sure. Yes, sir.
Who votes on who you choose?
Well, our staff and myself and the investment consultants make recommendations to the board. The board vets the money managers, and the board of trustees ultimately votes to approve the allocations in the money managers.
So the board of trustees is also who voted for the 5% increase?
Yes, sir.
So at the end of the day, the board of trustees votes for who manages the money. And if the management misses the benchmark, they can vote to increase on the counties and cities in the state to make up for the losses.
Well, you kind of, the board does have in the law, the authority to basically manage the system. I think you're mixing a couple different topics. Does the board under current law set the contribution rate? Yes, sir. Does the board vote to change and terminate managers when needed and recommended? Yes, sir.
Okay, so it's not the only lever they can pull.
Well, I would just say quickly, and I don't know how much time there is, but I'm happy to discuss it to the extent preferred or necessary. But I really and truly, I don't think there's so many things to purge and such a complex situation and organization. In my opinion, investments, even though we'll be happy to give all this information, investments is not really the key challenge because, over the last 5, 10, 15 years, whichever time increment, when you compare to the benchmark, when you do the peer group comparisons, the investments perform pretty well and the fees seem to be very competitive and reasonable. We certainly monitor that all the time, regularly, ongoing, and we'll respond to this. But I think the challenge for PERS is more structural on the benefit side, I think. But
Well, and my last question, because we all represent PERS recipients. And from what I understood from what you said today, in 99 or 2000, this legislature added benefits without a funding mechanism. I understood
Yes,
that to
that's
be
my
your
understanding.
testimony. And in 99 or 2000, we have more or less state employees than we do today.
I think as far as the actives contributing to the system, it was about the same, maybe a little more. I'm sure many fewer retirees. I think the number of actives was probably just a little more. I'd have to look that up to go to 99, but.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We are going to recess subject to call so we can continue this hearing. So we've got a little time. Senator Barrett? No, we're not going to recess subject to call. They're going to recess subject to call on the floor so we can continue on. I hope nobody pulled a hamstring getting up. Senator Barrett?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is, I guess, focused on the funding aspect. I understand that in looking, I guess, researching some other states, I found that for one, let's just say Tennessee, I think is third in the United States in state retirement funding. And it appears that, and this is just some quick research, that they went from 50% funded in 2009 to 98% funded now. Has the PERS board, PERS in itself, I mean, what are we actively doing to protect our state's retirement? Are we looking at what other states have done?
Sure, certainly. And thank you for that. And I apologize. I got a little distracted. Didn't hear all the question, but I got the gist of it. And probably in Tennessee, I don't know without hearing all of that or checking the dates, but they probably had some pension reform at some point during that time. As far as the question of us looking at other states, certainly we look at other states, what other states have done. We've had several workshops over the last couple of years looking at ideas and options and contingency options. I've made suggestions and recommendations and so forth, and the board actually at the last meeting in December, when in the same meeting where the rate was increased, passed a motion for us to prepare a potential tier 5, in other words, pension reform, if you will, and other options to consider. And we're working on that now, and we'll be talking with the board at a meeting later this month. So to your question, absolutely, yes, we look at various options. Right now, the benefit structure is set in law, and to make any changes for that, it would require a law change, but we definitely look at that. Yes, sir.
When you said you need a law change, you stated earlier that y'all have the authority in statute to manage the system. Why would, so you have the ability to make changes to PERS to implement something like that, do you not?
Well, it depends on what it is. The benefit structure are set and outlined in the law. What I was referring to, and I mentioned that in response to the question, was the board has, I guess there's language in there that give the board the powers and ability to promote regulations and rules and administer the benefits. But the benefit structure and the benefit accrual and the COLA and all those things are set in statute.
Okay. Senator Bryan, you have a question?
I don't know what all the terms are, and I'm not sure I'm using them right, but I think I'm trying to ask a question about normal cost. But if we were starting the system today and we had the benefit scale that we have today, and we had an employee contribution of 9%, which is what I think it is, what would the employer contribution need to be to take care of people who are going to work today with the benefit system that we have?
Not much. It'd be a much smaller amount. As I understand your question, referring to normal cost, meaning the cost that's to reflect the benefits accruing on an annual basis, just for, like you said, for a new employee. I want to say from memory, it's around 10.6%. And then the employee contribution, that's a shared cost between the employee and the employer. The employee contribution, as you cited, is 9%. So the employee hired today is paying the great majority, probably over 80% of that normal cost, which I think is a little over 10%, I believe 10.6.
I'm not sure, but the question I was asking is, if we started this system from scratch today with the benefit structure that we have, and the employees were paying 9%, what would the employer contribution need to be? And I think the answer to that question is about 2%.
That's correct, 1.6 on that math.
Okay.
Yeah, yes, sir.
So my point, Mr. Chairman, is this. The current structure of the system is not the problem, because the 9% employee contribution plus 2% will take care of everybody that's coming onto the system now. The difficulty is there's this debt, this obligation, and we're paying that off through employer contributions because that's what can be changed. And so the 20% employer contribution over and above the 2% is all going to pay off what's left over from previous years. And that's not going away. That's a dollar amount that's there. Under the structure of the system, the only way we can deal with it is increasing employer contributions. But if we ended the system today, that amount of liability would still be there, and it'd have to come from somebody. And I don't want to, much of the discussion basically is, isn't there some way to make this hunk of money go away? And not unless you're going to take benefits away from people who've already earned them. And so that, to me, is what we need to remember and focus on. We could talk forever about what decisions were made, when, where, and how, but Sonny dies in April, so we don't have time for all that. But I don't want people to think there's some magic thing we can do that we can get this change or that thing or the other thing without dealing with that debt that we have.
Thank you, Senator Bryan. One of the questions I want to ask you, and you talked about this last year, is future funding levels. I think you mentioned out into 2040 is when you thought the funding level would be, the ratio would be much more improved and positive. Can you explain, and I think Senator Bryan alluded to it, is the new employees are cheaper. It's a cheaper cost on the system than it is the prior employees prior to 2011. Can you explain how, where that funding, that number is, what year that goes out to now? I don't know if it's changed.
Sure, I can. If I could, now we have a little more time. I'd like to go back to this senator's question, if I could, I think, but not only be relevant to his question, but be good for this and others to hear. What I believe you're referring to is a metric in the funding policy, which is projected funded ratio in 2047.
Mm-hmm.
And last year was more positive. This year it's not as positive. But that's one of the key metrics in the funding policy, which is, again, projected funded ratio in 2047. Last year, I want to say it was projected 80 or 90%. This year, with the results, is projected at around 48% if we didn't increase the rate.
Projected at what?
48%.
48?
48, if the rate was not increased based on the actuarial information.
So last year, before we increased the rate, it was projected to be 90%. 1 year later, without increasing the rate, it's projected to be at 48%.
That's correct. And that, of course, last year, just like this year, it's based on assumptions. That's the actuarial information. You can find it in the reports and the website. But it's based on assumptions, based on information at the time. What I will say is that particular ratio is very sensitive to the asset gains and losses. That's why we look at other things. We look at the current ratio, we look at the current valuation, we look at two other metrics in the funding policy, one being cash flow, the other one being the actuarially required contribution. If I can, let me use this to go back to his question from last year and talk just about a little bit about that. I do remember your question. And I won't say that I worried about it, but I remembered it because I remembered last year thinking after the meeting, reflecting back, I thought, reflecting back on some of the questions and discussion, I was like, some of that come across too positive. Now, I don't really regret it because the only way I can give you an honest and accurate update last year was to tell you what the investment return was, tell you what the funding policy metrics are, tell you what the results are, because everything's driven on that. So I don't really regret it because there's no way to give you an honest and accurate update. But I left thinking that, just reflecting back on the discussion, that was a little bit too positive. So you may see me be more negative in the future. I'll say half jokingly. Back to a more serious note now, basically what's happened is the negative year has offset the very positive year. And we're essentially back where we started from before the pandemic. And I'll cite a few numbers on that. The 3-year return is around 7.85%. And that's not bad. It's above the assumed rate, but it's nothing to write home about as far as holding off some of the structural or challenges or anything like that have been developing, with PERS over the 20 years. And I know we covered some of that, didn't quite finish that, but that's some of the things. Another part I would mention there is, that's probably a little bit too much in the weeds, but prior to the record returns, prior to last year, because a couple of years we didn't necessarily meet as much in person with the pandemic and everything, the actuary had already recommended an increase. And the ADEC, the required amount was already up over, it was like 19 something, I think. So there was already, prior to all that, a recommended increase. We didn't do it at the time because the board was studying it. We were very sympathetic to the cost on employers. We're always going to act in the best interest of the system and the membership, but we're very sympathetic to the cost on employers, and that contribution rate risk is certainly a risk we have to consider too. So even though the actuary had previously recommended it, we didn't act on it. And then you had a lot of anomalies associated with the pandemic, one of them being the quick downturn and then rebound. Then you had the record return. So nobody was thinking any of that was going to be sustained, but you just had it's a unique time in history, and we all know that on the economic front and in our personal lives. But the actuary had recommended, that's the main theme I want to make out, is the actuary had recommended that prior to that, and we paused. And then with the record return, once that was realized, the actuary actually didn't recommend it last year, which is what I reported. Instead, he recommended just watching several things closely. And of course, one of those was investment returns. And had we had a good year or a positive year, not a record year, not a 20% year, but even a good year, we may not be here today. But unfortunately, the economy turned, and not only for last fiscal year, but it continues now, and there's more volatility on the horizon. So in short, the negative and the outlook has wiped out the positive, but there was the recommendations before the positive return. But we'll certainly keep that in mind in the future, and we look at it regularly. And that projected funded ratio is sensitive to the asset changes, more so than maybe some of the other parts.
Okay. Thank you. Senator McMahon, you had a question?
Yeah, some of this I know, but for the sake of the public hearing, Director Higgins, what's the total number of board members?
10.
All right, there's 10 members. How many of those are voting members?
All 10.
What's the makeup of elected versus appointed board members?
Basically 8 to 2. What we have, there's 2 elected by retirees, 2 elected by actives, 1 elected by public schools and community colleges, 1 elected by the counties, 1 elected by the cities, and then the treasurer is ex officio, and 1 gubernatorial appointee. That should be 10. So 8, I guess 8 to 10. And of course, the treasurer is statewide elected officials, so however you want.
And of the elected board members, so they all vote. Okay, how many was the decision to raise the rate unanimous?
It was not unanimous. It was 7 to 3 in favor.
Who opposed it?
Treasurer McCray, Commissioner Chris Graham, and George Dale.
Is it true that there could be a possible new category or a new tier for future beneficiaries, and that would definitely weigh on the that would definitely change the formula as far as the cash flow and the amount of money on hand?
It's certainly possible. That's something that we've looked at, something that we've studied in workshops, something that I've recommended. That's what I was alluding to earlier or mentioned earlier, is something that at the same board meeting, there was a motion passed for me to prepare potential tier 5 and other options for consideration, something we're working on now, and we'll come back So that's definitely a possibility. Look forward to working with all of you in the future, whether it be now or next session. And one thing, if I can, what I would like to take this opportunity to comment on about a potential tier 5 is, even though I think pension reform to consider would be good, and I look forward to working with you on it, as it relates to a tier 5, referring to something that would only affect new employees in the future, even though I think it's important, I think it'd be a good step in the right direction. Just please know that that's not a quick fix. That takes time. That's not a cure-all. That's not an end-all. That's definitely not a quick fix. There's nothing magic about that. I think it's a good step in the right direction, but just want to make sure that doesn't guarantee anything or everything for the future.
Thank you for recognizing me, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Director Higgins.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Senator Hobson, welcome to Finance. You're recognized.
Thank you. Thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Finance Chair. Mr. Higgins, where does Mississippi, I think I saw that we're about 11th worst in the country in the unfunded liability category. Is that correct?
It would depend on which set of information or which policy organization, or, it depends on what we're looking at, but we're referring to that, which is another way of framing the funded ratio. I want to say we're probably at the lower end of the middle of the pack. Ours is around 61%. I think the median now is probably around 73 or 74%. So it depends on which data point or which organization we're looking at, but that sounds about right. We're definitely lower than average.
Okay, where do we stand on employee contribution? I've looked at this stuff before, but it's been a while. But how do we compare to other states as far as the percentage of the employee payment into the retirement system?
The employee contribution is much higher on average, well above the median, probably about 40 or 50% higher. I want to say for employee contributions for states like us with Social Security, I want to say it's around 6%, and then ours is 9%, so higher than the average.
And the employer contribution with the proposed increase to 22.4, where would that put us in relation to other states?
I think with that, it's probably going to be comparable. I think it's above average or above median. I want to say the last data that I saw as a median was probably around 14 or 15%. Now, that may be a little dated because the organizations that I refer to for that, it takes a while to compile it. So that may be a little bit old, like 21 information or 20, but it would be higher than the median there too as well.
Yeah, my recollection of looking at this at a conference about a year ago was that if we were in this 22% range, we're going to be on the higher end of both employer and employee contribution levels, correct?
Yes, sir. I think that's correct. Yeah.
Does that concern, is the board aware of that?
It does. I think it concerns all of us. We just all need to try to work together to, in the best interest of PERS and the state, and find solutions and all, but it definitely is. We're sympathetic to the cost. We just have to make sure as fiduciaries that the system's funded properly.
Do they take into account the other states and what other states are paying for employer and employee contributions in setting up the system, or recommend changes to the system if the employer and employee contribution get to the place where ours appear to be going?
Well, we do, and they can. We're unfortunately, though, limited right now as far as and actually doing anything, because everything's set in law. So anything like that and changing benefits or things would require a law change. Now, as far as making recommendations, we certainly consider that and have reviewed that, and they're in the process of firming up those recommendations for you, and look forward to working with you on that. And actually, while we're here, I would appreciate any feedback if that should be this session or next session. And we don't have to answer that now, but as far as making changes, we can't because we're limited by the law. But as far as making recommendations, absolutely.
Recommendations is what I'm referencing. What about I mean, I'm sure you're aware because you said it earlier, but is the board aware that the proposed increase would be a $265 million hit to the state budget?
Yes, sir.
And are they also aware that probably before last year, there would have never been a year in the history of our state that we could have funded state government without significant cuts to state agencies with that kind of increase, year-over-year increase in the employer contribution?
Yes, sir.
They're aware of that?
If I understood you correctly, we're definitely aware of the cost and the estimates and the impact.
Are
Sympathetic to it.
Do the agencies talk to the board about the fact that if our economy gets to what would be a standard year in recurring revenue, that that's a 4% increase year over year to the budget roughly? And that was considered in the discussions and debate?
Well, we do consider all of that. And again, sympathetic to the cost on the state, but as fiduciaries, we have to make our recommendations or the decisions based on what's in the best interest of the system. As far as state agencies, they certainly can. We're open, responsive, very apt to talk with them. And I guess what I would point to is the two elected representatives for the actives is maybe that voice being on the board, or same thing with the school systems. But your point's well taken. I definitely
Well,
understand. And we're
I just
sympathetic to the
wonder if there was input from the agencies, because in most years, if you gave that kind of increase to the budget, agencies are going to get cut. And not to say they may not get cut this year, but I just wonder if that's part of the discussion. I mean, we've got, there are two players here. It's the retirees, of course. No, I don't think anybody wants to hurt or cut the retirees, certainly. But then you've got also how this affects the state budget, which is something I look at just a little bit from time to time. And how we factor in how much we're going to pay out of employer contribution has a direct impact on the state agencies and programs and opportunities for other people to have jobs and salaries and not get laid off and not have cuts and any number of things. So I just wondered if the board, if those were part of the discussions that were had.
It definitely is. Now, we have to always act as good fiduciaries, but with that said, I would say that's part of the reason that it wasn't raised year before last, or maybe the year before that, because the actuary has been recommending it, or it's been on the ADEC and a need to go up for a while. And I very much respect where you're coming from, and I'm sympathetic to the cost, but in our situation under current law, we just have to be good fiduciaries.
Well, when the board considers, well, let me rephrase that. If the board is meeting again and to discuss options and recommendations, will they consider the impact of that and other, as I think Senator Bryan and Senator McMahon, others may have alluded to, the possibility of tiers or other programs that might be effective rather than just a straight employer contribution increase?
Sure, we certainly can. We'll talk through that. We'll have some recommendations to that effect. Anything significant would require a law change, but absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Sparks for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wouldn't have cut short earlier, and I didn't mean to throw a question out at him and not let him have a chance to answer it,
Oh,
but
no problem.
I appreciate you coming back to it. And what I would like to see, I see 5 years worth of material on active members versus retirees, beneficiaries. The retiree beneficiary number for the last 5 years has been climbing while the active members have been falling. I would like to see 25 years worth of that. I would like to go back and see the old debt obligations, which Senator Bryan referred to, which we should honor. I understand that. Were created, and they were created by decisions that were made that were not funded. So, I want to be clear about that. But what I am most concerned about is that we act like the only funding mechanism for PERS is contributions. If we don't manage our investments well, that's a fiduciary duty. And that's, I think, the point. And the chairman, the first year we were here, I think tried to discuss this, and you would have thought the world was on fire. We are trying to manage the money of our retirees, of this real group of people who my mother is a part of. That's the piece I keep wanting to hear about. And we keep talking about contribution rate. So we went from 90% at some point in the future, we were going to be funded, to 48% in 1 year. And you said nobody thought about it, or nobody could see that coming. The very people that are supposed to see it coming are the investment professionals, of which I am not. So that's the most disturbing part to me. To the chair of appropriations, it's a huge hit to have to rearrange everybody's budget if we didn't have the funds for a 5% increase. We don't want to create new debt, new obligations that we have to honor. So that's the part I'm concerned about, Mr. Chairman, and to the PERS board. Is, you said earlier, the only lever you can pull is a contribution rate. And if that's the way the PERS board views this, it's a problem. The other lever is they control who manages the assets that are supposed to take care of our retirees. That's the part I'm concerned about.
Sure. Thank you for that, Mr. Chairman, if I could.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, well, appreciate that. All great points and great observations. A few things now. One thing, I don't, and maybe we misunderstood with the timeline and distractions and all, but I don't remember saying anything about nobody forecasted it. I apologize for that if there's confusion there. But I think we're mixing a little bit of apples and oranges in that projected wasn't really investments. That was the projected funded ratio, which a lot of things go into that projected funded ratio because it's the actuarial assets and the actuarial liabilities and how they compare and how they project that over 20-something years. So that ratio that we were talking about is a little different than the investment side. It's all related, but a little different. But to go back to the investments, I really appreciate your question. We'll be happy to get you all that information. Please make sure somebody take notes as far as the requested items. We'll get you all the follow-up and do so timely. I want to mention the investments. I want to mention the last 30 years of revenue, and I want to mention the lever. What I mean by us and the board, that only being the lever we can pull now, and I'm gonna come back to the investment part, but it is the way it is, and I appreciate the frustration, but the way the law is designed now, as it stands now, because we can't change benefits, the only lever, that's what is that employer contribution rate. Now, I appreciate the frustration behind the rate increase. I appreciate the frustration behind the 20 billion, but the 20 billion has been building over decades, and it's here, and it's not going away anytime soon. And we need to just find solutions to work together to try to manage with that. So that's what we're talking about the only lever we can pull. As far as investments, you're absolutely right. We have oversight of investments. We do that. And while there's always room to improve, as I said earlier, I really don't think investments are the main challenge here. The main challenge is just some of the structural difficulties. Again, there's always room to improve, but to go back to the investments, when we compare 5, 10, 15, 20 various increments, and we compare to benchmarks that are appropriate benchmarks, or if we compare to peer group comparisons, which are appropriate peer group comparisons, we compare favorably. We do well. There's always room to improve. You have ups and downs, but overall, it's not a bad comparison. And we monitor that regularly, and we make sure we hire good managers. We make sure we have appropriate fees. So I appreciate the question and the frustration behind it, and happy to work with you more on it and share it. But I just have to point out that the oversight and management of the investments, I don't think is the main challenge here. Always room to improve. But I'll give you another example that goes back a couple of years when I was brand new. When I was brand new, we were coming off about a 10-year bull run. And the question that I would get sometimes is, golly, it's been a 10-year bull run. Why is it still 61%? And I would say, great point. I hear you. I agree. But the answer to that is because the liabilities keep growing as well. And that's the benefit side. And that also includes the cost of living adjustment that is set in statute. And that is something that is, after one is retired for one full fiscal year, it's 3% simple up to age 55 or 60, depending upon when you are hired. And then it's 3% compounded after that. And that's set in statute. That's one of the ones that goes back to like 1999. And that has continued to grow. This year, that lump sum payment, which over 80% of the retirees do opt to take the 80%, that's the default option. That amount this past year in December was around a little under $800 million. And in fact, we paid out about $1 billion around the holidays, if you will. You got the $800 million I just talked about, plus the December payroll and January payroll. You add that together, it's about $1 billion. And that's set in statute, and it grows at about 50 million a year. Going back to overall revenue. And again, very much appreciate the interest and the oversight on the investments. But if you look at the revenue for PERS over the last 30 years or so, over half of that, over 50%, comes from investment earnings. Less than a third comes from employer contributions, which is very important. We understand that's taxpayer dollars, but it's less than a third. And of course, the remainder is the employee contribution. So we'll definitely get you that information. Appreciate your interest in it, but it's more structural, I think, than investment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The number you gave us last year, was that inclusive of the 5% recommendation when you thought, or when they thought we were going to be at 90% by that date? Was that inclusive of the recommendation they made, but the board had not acted on, or not?
No, sir. No, that was based on whatever the contribution rate would have been at the time. I'll have to go back and look at it, but didn't have that in it.
Senator Blunt for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With regard to Senator Sparks' concerns about the board investment performance, I'm looking at the thick book that has all been provided to us, and on page 13, the expected rate of return is 7.55%. The 10-year return that you've earned is 9%. The 20-year return is 7.6%. The 30-year return is 7.95%. So based on the actuarial assumptions on the investment side of where the money's coming from, the board has exceeded the expected return. Is that correct?
I think that's correct. That's not necessarily, our investment materials, all of which are not in there, is where we do the true benchmark, but you're right on your observation that say the 10-year return and the 30-year return is met the adequate amount on a gross basis.
And so the two main remaining factors are the ratio of actives to inactives. And every time we take a public service at the state or local level that was performed by PERS contributing employee and privatize it and give it to somebody else who's not paying into the system, that ratio gets more and more out of whack.
That's correct. That could be a factor. Anytime there are fewer actives, that would affect that ratio.
And then the benefits are what this legislature says they are. And that's not up to the board. We look to the board to give recommendations to us for the long-term sustainability of the system. And I do think that is the board's responsibility. But the decisions on those recommendations can only be made here and not by the board. Isn't that right?
That's right. That's correct. As far as changing the law and benefits, and we'd certainly be happy to provide recommendations.
Great. Thank you.
Senator Horn for a question.
Thank you, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Higgins, we keep hearing rumors about recession, downturn in the economy going forward. We lost almost 10% of our assets last year. And if we have a market, a bear market like we had last year into this year, what's your prognostication of the status of our fund?
Well, I don't want to necessarily predict the future, but you're right. Last year was down around a negative 8.5%, and mainly as a public pension fund, we focus on the long term. That's why we do maintain a well-diversified portfolio, though, with the attempt to maximize return and minimize risk on the long term. We either are in or could be heading toward a recession. That'll certainly have an impact short term. No doubt we won't be immune from that, just like we weren't last year or in other downturns, but we stay diversified so we can minimize that impact and focus on the long term. And as far as recession, if you go back a few quarters, we did have the two negative consecutive quarters of GDP growth. That's been a common definition of a recession. The formal ones, I think from the National Economic Bureau of Research or something to that effect, they have a more broad definition, which is where that comes into play. But certainly, I think it's safe to say that a contraction or a slowdown is on the horizon.
Okay, and can you talk a little bit about where we are in terms of our workforce? How many state workers are there right now, and folks who participate in the pension?
We have around 144,000 active members in PERS, and that's active members, working employees paying in. That's state agencies and local. That's everybody paying into PERS. And then we have around 114,000 retirees on the payroll. So 114,000 of the active membership, I want to say around 40% comes from public schools.
Right. And in previous years, I've heard folks say that you got to feed the beast. That the nature of the system is that you got to keep adding personnel. You got to keep hiring folks. And our state workforce, I think, is fairly stagnant right now. I don't know about the rest of the participation in PERS, but state government appears to be not growing a whole lot in terms of personnel. What's your perspective and position about whether we got to keep feeding the beast?
Well, just, speaking in the context of what you brought up from the pension side, we do see that active number that's been slowly declining. It's been going down the last few years. It's not just state agencies, but all the members, the active members coming into PERS. Again, around 144,000 now, which is slight decline from last year. And over the last 10 years, I believe it's declined about 10 or 11%. So at this point, I think we would probably project a slight decline or a leveling off, but it's hard to determine the future in that respect.
Is it a good idea for us to remain stagnant with our employment? Or do you have a recommendation on that one way or the other?
Well, more actives paying in could potentially help the system and would, affect that active to retiree ratio I talked about. So more employees paying in could help, but it's not the only factor and probably not necessarily the largest factor. An important factor, but not the only.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sure.
Thank you. Director Higgins, what is the actuarial assumption on employees or increase? Is there an assumption that we are growing our employment base year over year?
There is a growth, an assumption on that, as well as wage inflation assumptions, many of them. I don't know off the top of my head what the exact rate is for that particular assumption, but we can get that for you, and they do take that into account.
Okay, well, if they're making an actuarial assumption that there's an increase in employment at the state level, and I don't know if there's been an increase at the state level since I've been here. I think every year it's gotten smaller and smaller. At what point do we kind of throw that out and create a new assumption that I mean, if you've had 3 or 4 years of consecutive years of no growth in employment, what good are your actuarial numbers that you're using to come up with your numbers and your figures and your assumptions?
Sure, great point, and that is factored in. And how we really monitor that, we look at it regularly, but in particular, every 2 years, we'll do an actuarial experience study. And so that'll be a separate process where the actuary will come in, look at all the assumptions, see what the assumption was, see what really happened, and then propose changes. So we change them going forward, do that every 2 years. And on that note, one of the things I also wanted to mention that's happened since we met last is we completed an actuarial audit. We only do that every 5 years, but when we do that, we do an RFP to get another actuarial firm that's on par with our regular consulting actuary to come in and do a full audit, replicate the liabilities and rates and things of that nature for our actuary. And pleased to report, we had a positive report. There were some minor recommendations around reporting and transparency, mainly for the smaller systems, but very positive report for the big things. And that's important because an example of the question like you just asked, but then also when you think of the recommendations and the decisions that are made on that, it's good to have a positive report there.
Okay. I'm going to ask a question, and I'm not an attorney, so I don't know the answer, but how many assumptions do you have I mean, is it 50, 100, or is it 10? Are there like major assumptions that you basically use to come up with your prognostication or kind of the way you view everything, or are there hundreds of them? I mean, I don't know.
I wouldn't say hundreds, that's probably more in the 10s and 20s. I'd have to look at it
Okay.
more to think, but it's, the demographics, mortality, actives, retirees, investment returns, there's several. I don't know about hundreds, but there's many.
Okay. You mentioned earlier that there are 74 members of PERS that are over 100 years.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Do you know the average of their benefit?
Yeah,
I mean, I'm just curious,
this year it's
interesting to-
around 26,000 with the COLA. It's closer, it's close to the same average benefit of all members. In years past, it's been a little less, but from memory, it's around 26,000 with the COLA.
$1,000 a year.
Yeah, with the COLA. And that's the thing about the COLA overall, that, the average PERS benefit for everybody, not only those, but all of them is around 26,000 with the COLA. You do have outliers, but the average is around 26,000.
6,000. Okay. Senator Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Higgins, just so I understand, I've heard there's been a lot of talk here today about being a fiduciary and a lot of talk about the laws. Just so, so we can, and I'm the new guy here on this committee. Is there anyone from the PERS board or from the PERS office who contacts the legislature or whomever and says, hey, we've got a law problem, not a funding problem. Can y'all do something as a fiduciary? Do you know if, and like I say, I'm new, has anybody ever done that and said, hey, we need some help with these laws, the way these regs are set up?
We do. We've done it from time to time. I don't know in this particular case, we've done it this year. However, to be just in all candor, all the feedback that we've heard, received, assessed, or anything like that, up till recently, maybe even to now, is it may not be ideal to propose changes to PERS in an election cycle. But
Right.
we certainly can do that. And we've done that from time to time. We had some legislation last year, and
Yeah.
we had some we approved this year, but didn't move forward. And look forward to doing that. So,
Yeah, that's great.
yeah, no doubt.
Thank you.
Well, I can tell you what happens when you file a dummy bill because you don't get to meet because of COVID. And you agree to let it die if there is no need from PERS, and your phone lights up like a Christmas tree. So anyway, does the board have a contingency plan in place if, I mean, we went from a 32% increase to a -8%. You have 2 or 3 years like this in a row, and your funding levels drop to, I mean, what is considered an emergency on you? I mean, I'm interested to hear what PERS thinks. What is considered bad?
Well, I'm gonna say the answer to that's yes, and give you a little description outline of what we would consider that to be. And I like the word contingency because at this point, this is what I would refer to it as. We do look at different scenarios. We monitor that. We do different projections. We do a sensitivity analysis. We do some stress testing, if you will, whether it's called that or not. So we do that, and that's very informative for us, and it could be for y'all. So the answer to that is we definitely monitor that and look at that. As far as what would be bad, I'm going to use that and I'm going to frame that in the context of something we've talked about when would it, really you need to make a change for sure. And that what we've used in discussion would be when the funded ratio or the projected funded ratio dips below 50%. And so that's what we've talked about with the actuary as in that regard. As far as a contingency plan, some of the things that we have looked at extensively, some of the things that we've calculated, some of the things that I've recommended, some of the things I'll be revisiting later this month as a contingency option is the few different ones. They deal with the COLA. One would be as a contingency, temporarily suspending the growth in the COLA for say 3 years. Another one could be changing the COLA to being simple going forward as opposed to compounded. Another one could be maybe, instead of 3% growth, it'd be 2% growth. Now, to be clear, the board has not endorsed these options. That's just me answering the question and talking through some of the things that we've worked through and consider contingency options and things that we'll be revisiting. All of them would require a law change. If it needed to be done, the legislature could either do it or the legislature could change the law to empower the board to do it. And the way I suggested it and talked through it before was something to the effect of if based on actuarial necessity, if needed to maintain the fiscal integrity of the plan, then the board could temporarily adjust the COLA or something to that effect. In other words, if it was needed to save the plan, to give some numbers to that. And again, based on assumptions, based on estimates. So they're good estimates and good assumptions, but you can't predict the future. But if you were to temporarily suspend the growth in the COLA for 3 years, that would have an estimated impact on the projected funded ratio of 12 or 13D. If you were to change the COLAs going forward from simple instead of compounded, it would have an estimated impact on the projected funding ratio, or the unfunded liability, I should say, of 10 or 11 billion. If you were to change the COLAs going forward to 2% instead of 3%, it'd have a larger projected impact than that. So definitely the answer is yes, but they involve dealing with existing benefits and would require a law change.
So 50% is the threshold that y'all consider to be danger zone.
That's what we've talked about as far as a time, yeah.
That's good to know. All right. Does anybody have any other questions? Ray, thank you for coming. This is certainly, I think we need to hear and discuss more about. I appreciate you making yourself available. You always have. Thank you to your staff for getting some information to us. And we may come back, have another meeting once everybody's had time to digest this and kind of think through some things. But I appreciate your time.
Yeah.
Very much.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thanks to the committee. Look forward to working with you.
Motion to rise and report. All in favor?
Yeah.
Opposed?
No, absolutely. Thank you.
Oh, the noes have it?
Oh, yeah. We need that.